All right, next we're going to work through the stages of learning. So we're going to cover a lot of different topics in regards to the stages of learning. So don't feel too intimidated. I'm going to highlight the things that you need to focus on as I normally do. So let's jump right into it. So an important characteristic of learning motor skills is that all people seem to go through distinct changes as they acquire skills. So the first part that we're going to talk about in the stages of learning is this three-stage model. So there's three stages in this Fitz and Posner model. And so I will quickly go through each stage of this model. So these two guys, Fitz and Posner, they proposed that learning a motor skill involves three stages. The first stage is the cognitive stage. This is when the beginner focuses on cognitively oriented problems related to what to do and how to do it. So, what's your objective? How far should I move this arm? What's the best way to hold this implement or hold this object? Where should this arm be when my right leg is here? You're trying to kind of problem solve your way through the skill initially. So, there's lots of errors. It's like most people when they throw with their opposite hand that they normally do. They're like, okay, well, how do I do this? How do I slowly move through this skill so that I can figure out how to match it up to what I would throw with my dominant arm? So that would be kind of like the cognitive stage. The second stage is the associative stage. So this is the transition into the stage that occurs after an unspecified amount of practice and performance improvement. The cognitive activity will decrease at this stage because now the person attempts to associate specific environmental cues with the movements required to achieve the goal of the skill. So this is kind of like your refining area. So when you learn to throw with your non-dominant arm, you're going to start to pick up on things like, okay, I kind of know to release the ball when my hand's in this certain location relative to what I see on the wall. So my hand has to be about at eye level when I release the ball, or else I'm going to throw it into the ground or throw it way up into the air. So you're kind of starting to put some pieces together. You're still thinking, there's still some cognition to this, but it's not as integrated as the cognitive stage. And then finally, the third stage is the autonomous stage. Now, it seems relatively straightforward. Autonomous being the term automatic. This is when you have things completely refined, it becomes habitual, and it's very easy for you to do this skill and potentially have to do other skills at the same time, right? So you can start to multitask things together because it doesn't require as much attentional demand as it did early on. So again, thinking back to last chapter, this would be something that would cross over quite well into that. So again, three stages: Fitz and Posner model, cognitive stage, associative stage, autonomous stage. Moving on. Look who's back, Gentile. And they had a two-stage model. So they initially had the initial stage of learning, which has two important goals to achieve. One is to acquire movement pattern, and the second goal is to discriminate between regulatory and non-regulatory conditions in the environmental context in which he or she performs the skill. To achieve these two important goals, the beginner explores a variety of movement possibilities. So you have to pick a movement pattern that works best for you. And then through trial and error, he or she experiences movement characteristics that match or do not match the requirements of the regulatory conditions. So again, thinking about the environmental context, what surface are you on? Do I have to manipulate an object? Etc., etc. Does my movement pattern allow me to match the regulatory conditions that are in play for that skill? And then the second stage is called the later stages, how creative, where the learner works to achieve three important goals. The first is that the person must develop the capability of adapting the movement to specific demands of any performance situation requiring that skill. Second, the person must increase his or her consistency. And third, the person must learn to perform the skill with an economy of effort. So we're going to discuss each of these three characteristics as we kind of go through this next part. and you'll see how they apply. But essentially, Gentile's 2 stages are initial stage and later stages, and then each one of those stages, the initial stage trying to figure out a movement pattern and consider the regulatory conditions and if they match up. And then in the later stages is adaptation, so we talked about that in the last chapter. The second part is consistency, which we also talked about in the last chapter, and the economy of effort, which again kind of goes into reduction in attention demand, reduction in resource demand, like having to use extra muscles, etc., etc. So next, this is where we're going to start talking about performer and performance changes across the stages of learning. So we talked about like the 6 characteristics that you need to think about when people are learning and what you see in their performance change. And so now we're going to talk about a whole bunch of different categories here. So don't get overwhelmed. You can always come back, you can rewatch this. I'm going to go through each of these components so that you can understand some different things you're going to be seeing. Some things are going to be super obvious. Some things you're going to find very repetitive. And they might be, but just bear with me as we go through this next part. So the first thing you should see in performer and performance changes is changes in rate improvement. So as a person progresses along the skill learning continuum from the beginner stage to the highly skilled stage, the rate at which the performance improvements changes. As we talked about in the last chapter, the negatively accelerated pattern is more typical of motor skill learning because initially you're going to learn lots, you're going to be learning tons and tons and tons, and then as you master that skill or you become an expert, your learning curve is going to start dropping off. So you're going to see a curve that kind of looks like this if you can follow my mouse. Next is changes in movement coordination. So when we talk about movement coordination, the learner ultimately develops a coordination pattern that is dynamically stable and more economical. So the economy of movement is the idea that you don't make extra movements that you don't need to. You're really efficient, you're really economical, it looks really smooth. That is your change in your movement coordination, right? You're not going to be moving extra body parts that you don't need to. It's kind of like in running. You've all seen people who, flail their arms around all over the place, and you're like, well, I know that's not very efficient. So that's kind of something that you want to see as you improve in a skill, is more economy of movement. Next is changes in established or preferred coordination pattern. So we all have ways that we like to do things, but it may not be the best way of doing the skill. So what we want to see is that you either integrate your preferred movement pattern into the skill and make it work for you, or you're changing that preferred coordination pattern in order to match the skill that you need, right? So basically, when we get confronted with a new skill, we try to match it to a skill that we're comfortable with. So this is where we see, like, and in the example here, they see baseball players to use a swing resembling a baseball bat when they're practicing hitting a golf ball. Now, do those things cross over super well? Yeah, to a degree, but they don't exactly match up in the way that you want to perform the skills. So oftentimes there requires some more learning and more refinement to the swing that they use in order to apply it to the golf swing, or vice versa to a baseball swing. Next is changes in muscles to perform a skill. So we kind of talked about this, is there's more economy of movement. So initially when we first start learning a skill, there's tons of extra muscles being used, there's maybe lots of extra energy, lots of extra EMG activity, and then as time goes on, we get more efficient, it requires less energy, less muscles are involved, and we become more tolerant and just more automatic at doing that particular skill. So less muscles over time. Next is changes in energy costs. So again, talking about those last couple of concepts, how do we become more economical? You're going to use less energy, right? You're going to burn fewer calories. You're going to use less brain energy. That is going to be an important thing. as you get better at a skill, you don't want it to cost you as much energy. You want to be as efficient as possible. In addition to a reduction in energy cost, learners also experience a decrease in their rate of perceived exertion. So if any of you have ever seen this, if you've ever seen when people ask you about your rate of perceived exertion, they say, well, how hard are you working on a scale of 1 to 10? 1 being super easy, 10 being extremely difficult. And what we should start to see over time is as you become more masterful at doing a particular skill, we should see a decrease in that number. So maybe initially you're doing a skill and it feels like it's an 8 out of 10. But as you become an expert in that skill, it reduces and it feels like a 2 or a 3. Next is changes in visual selective attention. So we've talked about this as well. Like, what do experts pay attention to? What do they look at in certain contexts versus what do beginners look at? And that's what you start to change, and that's what you start to develop as you become better, right? You're not going to be paying attention to the same visual cues throughout that entire time. You're going to start picking out little things that are going to allow you to be more successful as time goes on. Next is changes in conscious attention demands. So I've already talked about this prior. This is basically like how much effort are you putting in right in that moment to pay attention to the skill you're doing, right? Like I'll use texting in class again, right? When you guys first got your phone and it's brand new to you and you don't know where the keyboard is, you need to spend more conscious attention on that phone in order to be able to execute your text message accurately. But as you get better and better at it and you understand your phone and you feel more comfortable with it, you don't really need to pay attention, right? You can not even look at your phone at times and you can type a pretty coherent message because it doesn't require as much conscious attention. Or you don't need to pay as much attention to something like walking because it's so automatic, so you can focus your attention on other things while you're doing that skill. Next is changes in error detection and correction capability. So as you become more masterful at a skill, you can pick up on your own mistakes relatively easily, right? You don't always need someone to give you augmented feedback or verbal feedback that tells you that you're doing something incorrectly or not. You can just rely on your own feedback and your own assessment of your skill in order to be an error detector for yourself and be able to make the appropriate corrections. Next is the change in brain activity. So we talked about how the brain changes over time, right? So this is the concept of plasticity. And the term plasticity or plastic is basically implying that it can change over time. So anything that is deemed as, if you hear the term plastic when you're talking in neurological terms or really any physiological terms, it is the idea that you have the capacity to change over time. So one thing that we see is that we find some automatization of motor skills, excuse me for that, associated with an overall reduction in cortical activity. So we see less activity in the brain because someone has become more automatic at that skill. And the second part is that the brain undergoes structural changes in addition to functional changes when new skills are learned. So this group here, Dragansky and al., they showed that 3 months of juggling practice led to a significant, though temporary, bilateral increase of the density of gray matter in the mid-temporal area and the left posterior intraparietal sulcus. That basically, to dumb that down, is just to say, hey, if you learn a skill, you spend time integrating into that, you're going to see actual physical changes to your brain. They are going to get larger in some areas, potentially smaller in others. You're going to see more activity. If we put a functional MRI on your brain, we may see some changes that way. But the idea is to say that you have the capacity to change your brain, and it is plastic over time. Next, we've covered all of those concepts related to performer and performance changes. Next, we're going to talk about expertise. So what does it take to become an expert? So we all look at certain things and we've all probably heard different things at times. And some of those you're going to hear right away here, but what does it take to be an expert? The first thing that we want to talk about is like how much time, how much practice, what kind of practice do we need to do? And this group here in 1993, they reported that expertise in all fields is a result of intense practice for a minimum of 10 years. So the critical point there is obviously noting the intense practice component. And now we're starting to see other evidence here as well. Like we know that there are other factors that kind of go into expertise. Like you obviously have to be practicing the correct things. You have to be getting proper feedback that allows you to reach that mastery component because, you know, as some people have in their lives, you spend lots and lots of time on a particular skill, but if you're not getting the proper feedback and you're not, you know, maybe you don't possess the tools that allow you to get to the next level of where you want to go to, it's going to be really challenging for you to make the improvement to the point where you get become an expert. The next component is that your expert's knowledge structure is significantly higher than non-experts. So they just know more about that skill than a beginner does. They understand the nuances to it. They understand how to move, how to get from point A to point B more efficiently than a beginner. In that component is problem solving, decision making, and anticipation. So experts, they're able to solve problems and make decisions faster and more accurately than a non-expert can, and adapt to novel environments more easily. So use an example of a basketball player bringing the ball down to the floor, and they can look at one or two players from the other team and know which type of defense the team is using. They have the capacity to anticipate things more readily than the beginner does. And that makes sense, right? If you've done something for a very long time, you're just going to understand the little nuances and little things that are going to help you get, again, from point A to point B more efficiently than someone who's never done it before. Next is the expert's use of vision. So they use vision more advantageously than non-experts. Shocker, right? They search their environment faster. They give more attention to the search, that visual search we talked about earlier, and they select more meaningful information in less time. So they know what to pick on, you know, like certain, I always talk to goalies about this. Like I work with hockey teams and I'm like, okay, well, what are you looking for, right? What kind of things help kind of give away where a person's shooting? And they're like, well, yeah, looking at the puck is important, but lots of times they're looking at the person's hands, or they're kind of looking at the person's chest, like where the chest kind of moving towards, and it helps them anticipate, helps them take in that information so that they're able to stop that puck more efficiently. Next is automaticity. So some people think that, hey, experts, they just reach this stage of complete effortlessness where everything's so easy and they don't have to think twice about it. And there are degrees of that are true, and that's kind of what we talked about. But there's also components where people, according to Erickson in 1998, he said that experts attempt to avoid the stagnation associated with complete automaticity because they have a desire and need to make continued improvements and to cope with new situations. So, you know, again, I'm going to talk about golf here, but you know, if you're really good at just hitting balls on the driving range on a nice flat surface, like that's awesome. But you're also going to want to prepare for when you're on side hills or down hills or up hills, or you're in the sand or you're in the rough. You know, or if you're on different types of grass, you're going to want to prepare for those things, and you're going to want to master those things so that when you do get in those contexts, you're well prepared to handle that. So experts, obviously, they've reached some automaticity in certain components, but they also want to prepare themselves for other things as well. So that is the end of Chapter 12. We're going to finish up Unit 4 in Chapter 13, so I will see you shortly for that video as well.